Thank you. It's nice to be back and give you an update since last year. This is work I'm doing with some doctoral students at Carnegie Mellon and Abigail Panter at UNC's Chapel Hill. The central question that's guiding this work and that I'll present today is what aspects of a person are indicative of moral character. So to begin, we can think about personality. And I think of moral character traits as a subset of personality traits. So we might think of personality as an individual's characteristic patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior, together with the psychological mechanisms hidden or not behind those patterns. And if we adapt that to think of moral character, we might think of moral character as the characteristic patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior underlying moral or ethical and immoral or unethical behavior. And as you can see with this definition, I'm going to use the words immoral and unethical interchangeably. I'll use the words moral and ethical interchangeably to refer to behaviors that are good or bad, right or wrong, that most people agree. And this will be different than the more philosophical approach of moral dilemmas where we don't really know what's right or wrong. So here, I'm going to focus on behaviors that most people agree are right or wrong. Good or bad, but nonetheless, people do them anyway, some more than others. This question of what traits are character traits has a long history in psychology and other fields. We can go back to Sigmund Freud, we can think of Gordon Allport, but despite this question being asked, little consensus has emerged as to what traits are the most important for predicting moral and immoral behavior. What traits are character traits, what are not? I think one reason is a lack of integration. So many people study different traits. So I have studied guilt proneness, Angela studies self-control, other people study empathy, some people study moral identity, others moral development. Not much integration across different traits, and when there is, it tends to be at the level of broad personality dimensions, such as the Big Five or Hexaco model that are looking at things like agreeableness, conscientiousness, very broad traits, and there's not many integrative studies. I think this is problematic from a theoretical perspective because we don't know what we should be focusing on and what traits are important for moral character, but also a very practical one. So if you're thinking of talking to a practitioner or a human resource manager and they asked you, I'm interested in predicting who's going to behave unethically in my organization, what aspects of personality should I focus on? What should I measure if resources are limited and time is limited? You could mention any number of traits. You might say self-control or conscientiousness. You might say guilt proneness, empathy, moral identity, any of these traits. But it would feel unsatisfactory because there's no clear evidence for you to say which are more important than others and which aren't important, which can you decide not to measure. Another reason for the lack of integration, I think, is because the field of moral psychology hasn't focused much on character traits, but rather there's been a strong emphasis on disentangling the role of cognitions versus emotions. And that work focuses on moral judgments, on situations where it's hard to figure out what's right or what's wrong. So the psychologists Arcia Narvaez and Jonathan Haidt have an exchange back in 2010 where they've focused on the relative merits of emotional and intuitive kinds of processes versus more higher level reasoning and really thinking carefully and thoughtfully about a problem. But these are using things like the trolley dilemma where should you kill one person by a variety of means to save five, or Kohlberg's classic dilemmas like should Heinz steal a drug to save his dying wife? These are situations where multiple moral considerations and values are at play. So it could be harm and care and loyalty and fairness and justice might all be relevant, but they might be in conflict. The work I'm going to present is looking at what predicts the more everyday behaviors that people would agree are right or wrong. How can we know what's associated with those? So the current project, as you may remember from last year, we looked at 22 different individual differences to answer this question of what is moral character. And some of the strengths of the project are that we use multiple measures to describe the attributes of high and low moral character adults. We use multiple reporters, the self and coworkers, to understand how character is manifested in work behaviors. And we use longitudinal assessments where we measured work behaviors over a 3-month time period. We wanted to test whether moral character plays a role in decreasing unethical work behaviors and increasing ethical work behaviors beyond basic demographic variables and basic attributes of the work setting. To give you a preview of the findings before I dive into more of the method and results, our results are going to challenge the idea that individual differences in moral reasoning or emotionality are critical determinants of character. Instead, they suggest that traits that measure or that tap into things like consideration of others, self-control, concern for the future, a desire for a moral identity, these are going to be relatively more consequential for determining moral character. Moreover, by showing that individual differences in moral character have consistent, meaningful effects on employees' work behaviors, this work is going to contest situationist perspectives that de-emphasize the importance of personality for predicting behavior. So we're going to say over time in people's work lives, as reported by themselves, as reported by their coworkers, on the basis of their self-report responses to questionnaires, we can predict who's going to be likely to who's going to engage in unethical behaviors, lying, cheating, stealing, who's going to engage in more virtuous helping behaviors, staying late to help a colleague, making your office a better place. How we come to these conclusions is through what I'm calling the Work Experience and Character Traits Project, the WECT project. And this involved 2 studies. They were the same, basically, a weekly online diary study, where our goal was to investigate how a number of different influences affect work behaviors. So we looked at individual differences, what I'll call character traits, other aspects of personality, emotions that people experienced every week, their treatment by managers and coworkers. How do they affect counterproductive work behavior and organizational citizenship behavior? These are acts that harm organizations or the people within them, or acts that help organizations or the people within them. Okay. Before conducting this project, we did a pilot study of over 400 adults and people who are employed, where we presented them with a list of all these different behaviors of counterproductive and citizenship acts, all intermixed, and we had them rate them on how moral versus immoral do you see these acts. All of the counterproductive acts in our survey were rated as immoral, significantly below a neutral midpoint. All of the helpful acts, citizenship, were judged to be moral, above a neutral midpoint. And if you look at the behaviors, these are not moral dilemmas. Most people agree, what we found, that putting in to be paid for more hours that you worked, insulted or made fun of someone at work, took supplies home without permission, came to work late, blamed someone without permission, blamed someone at work for an error you made. These are acts that employed adults view as wrong, they view as immoral. The helpful acts: volunteered for extra work assignments, went out of the way to give coworker encouragement or express appreciation, decorated, straightened up, otherwise beautified a common workspace, helped a coworker learn new skills or shared job knowledge. All of these were viewed to be moral. And we had a list of 20 of the helpful acts, 30 of the counterproductive acts using some established scales from the industrial organizational psychology area. Okay, so that was a separate study. And having satisfied this idea, our assumption that these counterproductive acts are viewed as wrong, bad, immoral, and the citizenship helping acts are viewed as good, moral, we then went on to conduct this diary study, which involved an initial survey where we assessed a number of different individual differences, people's job descriptions, different aspects of the work environment. And then each week, for 12 weeks, we sent them a link where they could fill out a survey about their behavior during the past week at work. Those surveys asked about their citizenship acts, their counterproductive acts, as well as how they were treated by others, their mistreatment by their supervisors, justice and fairness at work, their emotions during the past week. There was a final survey, which is very similar to the initial, to look at change over time, which is something I can speak about in the questions if you're interested, but won't talk about today. And about a third of the way into the project, we asked the participants for the email address of a coworker who we could contact, who could answer a survey about them. And we contacted the coworkers to ask them about the participants' work behaviors and also their personality and moral character, so we could get informant reports, knowing the limitations of self-reports that we just discussed. Good so far? Good. All right, so the results, what did we find? First, how do we analyze the data? We used latent profile analysis, which is a type of cluster analysis. And the idea here is that a profile analysis categorizes people into clusters, into groups, latent classes, based on their responses to a variety of measures. So if you take all of the different 22 individual differences and you subject it to a latent profile analysis, it will distinguish the groups such that individuals in the same latent class are assumed to be similar to others in their class, different from individuals not in their class. We compared different solutions, ultimately decided on a 3-class solution. These 3 classes separate the low moral character class from the high moral character class. We were looking at what variables really distinguish these groups of people. Okay? This kind of analysis can give you a nice figure like this. And as you can see, the red triangle bar, that's the high moral character class. Here, this is the first iteration of the project, where we had about 1,000 people, and there's about a third of the sample was classified as high moral character. About 20% was at low moral character, and the rest in the middle. The blue circle bar would be the low moral character class. And some variables, you can see there's a big distance between the high moral character class and the low moral character class. And the idea here is these variables are particularly important for distinguishing these two groups of people. So variables like empathic concern, moral identity, guilt proneness, conscientiousness, perspective taking, consideration of future consequences, honesty, humility, there's large differences between these groups. Now, other variables, and then if you look at the end, some reverse. Exploitiveness and entitlement is an aspect of narcissism. So low moral character would have higher scores on these traits.
Just a question of clarification. So when you say high, average, low moral character, and then that was based on their infractions?
No. So I'll come to that. So that's a good question. So hold on for a moment. So this is just, I'm labeling these groups, and we'll show that it predicts their behavior. So you're with me so far, though. This is just 3 groups. We could call them anyway, group A, B, and C. But as we see the pattern of scores and as we see their behaviors later, I think we'll address that point. So these 3 groups. So some variables in the middle here, there's not much overlap. So cognitive moral development, emotionality, some other variables I'll come to in a moment, don't really distinguish these groups. Okay? And we see basically the same pattern of findings with our second study that we ran with about 500 adults. And this one included self-control, Machiavellianism, but besides that, had all the others. Okay, so this is to your point, Angela. The groups identified by this analysis differ. They differ in the way we showed by these variables. But is it appropriate to label one class low moral character and another class high moral character? If these latent classes are indicative of moral character, then we should observe corresponding differences in the amount of counterproductive acts and the amount of citizenship acts committed by the different members of the group. So we suggest that the people that we're saying are low moral character should commit more frequent counterproductive acts, less frequent citizenship acts than those high moral character. And that is indeed what we find. And this is the frequency that they reported during the past week. These are self-reports over here in the 2 studies. This is their coworkers' reports of their behaviors over the past month. How many times did you go down this list of behaviors from 0 to 4 or more? The blue bar, the low moral character class, reported a lot more of these counterproductive acts than those with average character or those with high moral character. Okay, these are based on our classifications from the personality survey. The coworkers, same pattern, where the low moral character class were observed by their coworkers to have committed a lot more of these work behaviors. And then if we look at the citizenship acts, is the opposite. We see the high moral character group, according to their coworkers, are doing much more of these helping behaviors than those with average or low moral character. Okay, we do see some differences with the self-reports, but it's interesting that it's the high moral character group that's particularly moral, doing more of these good things, not much difference between the low and average here. It might suggest that helpful behaviors are not doing them isn't necessarily immoral, but people who are particularly moral do a lot more of them. Now, if we control for a number of different attributes of the work setting, like is there an ethics code, income, other things that we thought might matter for their behavior, those attributes of the organizational setting didn't matter. Demographic variables, if we control for age and gender, we don't see much differences in models that include both moral character and age and gender. But we do see differences in age and gender in the moral character classes, which I'll come back to in a moment. So based on a number of different regression models we ran where we looked at these organizational characteristics, we found that moral character traits do predict harmful and helpful work behaviors more strongly and robustly than basic demographic and organizational characteristics. Okay, it's not to say the work environment is unimportant, but if you just look at basic things like whether there's an ethics code, income, those aren't the key drivers of unethical work behaviors. It seems to be these moral individual differences are. So if we think back to what were our results, what variables really distinguish the high moral character and low moral character classes, here are some of the aspects that we found large differentiation. So we might say moral people refrain from manipulating others. They're low in a variable called Machiavellianism. Okay, they consider other people's perspectives. They're high in perspective taking and empathic concern. They value integrity. They want to see themselves as moral, so they're high in moral identity internalization scale. They anticipate feeling guilty and engaging in repair-oriented actions if they did something wrong. So they imagine if they were to lie, cheat, and steal, they would feel bad about it, and then subsequently don't do that. They're disciplined, prudent, organized, good at resisting temptations. We just heard about this from the prior work, but they're high in conscientiousness and self-control. They think about the future consequences of their behavior and act accordingly, which I think is somewhat related to self-control. And they're sincere, modest, and fair. This general personality dimension of honesty, humility, they're higher in that. Now, I think all of you could probably look at that list and say, well, this makes sense. I might have expected these kinds of traits to matter. But one thing I find interesting is what didn't matter. And two in particular, cognitive moral development, which is moral reasoning ability, and emotionality, which is this broad dimension of personality similar to neuroticism or emotional stability. Many have suggested in prior work that these traits matter, but we found that they didn't differentiate these classes, suggesting they're not as diagnostic as the other variables we investigated. And if you look at the correlations with the work behaviors between some of the traits that we found to be particularly important versus cognitive moral development or emotionality, we see that these traits, which were not diagnostic in the latent profile analysis, also are unrelated to their work behaviors, as reported by people's own admissions, as reported by the coworkers. Whereas the traits we identified as being particularly important are significantly correlated with people's work behaviors over time, with their coworker reports of those work behaviors, both for harmful acts and helpful acts. Okay, so this corroborating evidence. Okay, and then we can see other aspects of personality. These big, broad dimensions are somewhere in between that may be a little bit relevant, but certainly not as relevant as some of the traits that we identified as more important. So if we think about moral reasoning, this is indicative of the complexity of a person's thoughts about difficult moral dilemmas. And we measured this with a widely used test called the Defining Issues test. We used a 3-dilemma short form. It takes about 20 minutes. We had to get it scored by the company that makes the test. It's widely used. And there is a meta-analysis, some prior work, that suggests that moral reasoning ability does predict unethical choices at work. But, so our results don't necessarily dispute that it can't have any effect, but it does suggest that where should we focus our attention? Maybe moral reasoning is not the key driver of unethical work behaviors. I'm sure it does predict people's decisions in difficult moral dilemmas, but the kind of everyday behaviors that we hope our colleagues do or don't do, we hope ourselves that we might do more of the good acts and less of the bad acts, moral reasoning ability does not seem to be as relevant. Okay? And the same I would say for emotionality. It's indicative of a person's fearfulness, anxiety, dependence, sentimentality. And prior research with the Big Five model, which looks at emotional stability, a similar trait, suggests that it might predict unethical behavior, but our results suggest that compared to conscientiousness and honesty, humility, these other two broad dimensions of personality, they seem to be more important. What's interesting, we looked at a lot of different measures, and looking at the results of what's important and what's not, reflecting on those, I think our results suggest there might be 3 kind of broad dimensions of moral character. Maybe there's more, maybe there's less, but these are how I would group them. I think consideration of others is one key component. So variables like empathy, like perspective taking, honesty, humility, guilt proneness, guilt repair orientation, low Machiavellianism. One of the things they share, all of those constructs, is they seem to reflect a consideration of others, or lack of consideration of others, or consideration of others versus the self. I think that's a different construct than self-control and concern for the future. So things like self-control, conscientiousness, consideration of future consequences, I think other measures tap into that. And that's probably something separate. Maybe that's more of the ability, and consideration of others is more of a motivation. Then we can think of desire for a moral identity. This is people who care about being moral or being seen as moral. I think just this one inventory measured it, but it does seem to be something different than the other 2 aspects that I've identified. And I'd love to hear your feedback of what you think of this kind of a classification. Again, this is not based on a factor analysis or looking at the dimensionality, but more our reflection of what seemed to matter. And that's how I would classify them. So question about gender and age, which I think are interesting. We thought, based on prior work, that we might see gender differences, but we didn't expect them to be quite as strong as they were. So here, the 2 different samples, the blue bar are men, and you can see those that were classified as low in moral character, that group, 70% of it was men versus only 29% women. And the sample overall is 50% men, 50% women. In the high moral character group, we get many more women, 56% versus 44% classified as high in moral character, and you get the same thing in the second study that we ran. So women are more likely to be classified as high in moral character, men were more likely to be classified in low moral character. It's unclear which of the traits in the analysis might tap into that, so Angela just showed it. Maybe it's not self-control, but maybe it is things like empathy or consideration of others, or maybe it is different aspects of moral character. Age is another that came out to be quite strong. So low moral character class, the average age in that group was 35 years, 36 years, whereas the high moral character class, the average age in those groups were 42 years or 43 years. and the average is a little bit in between. So we do see that older people, maybe because they're not tempted, or maybe because they're learning that their actions have consequences and they actually do a better job of perspective taking and being empathic, people do seem to either become more moral over time, or at least the high moral character class was older. Okay. So that was the first paper that we've written on this work, but we also have important other data that are interesting. And so this is a paper that I'm working on now with one of my graduate students, Young Kim, where we're looking at this reciprocal relationship between mistreatment, so how others treat you at work, and unethical behavior, counterproductive work behaviors, and the moderating effect of moral character, which I'll explain in a moment. Basically, our surveys, we had 4 different kinds of mistreatment, how you were treated by others. So we can think of disrespect, aggression, isolation, other behaviors that make employees feel unfairly treated. We asked them every week the extent to which they experience these things. So we asked about interpersonal conflict at work, basically were people nasty to you, the extent to which you felt discrimination and disrespected at work, abusive supervision, how your manager treated you and how poorly your manager treated you, workplace ostracism, did people ignore you and not talk to you? So we asked people about their experiences, and what we found first is that there's a lot of commonalities among these things, that people who have bad work environments, they tend to share a lot. They tend to be mistreated, have conflict, discrimination. They often report abusive supervision, ostracism. All of these seem to tap a similar thing that we'll call mistreatment. Okay? We then looked at how does mistreatment relate to counterproductive work behavior, and how does counterproductive work behavior relate to mistreatment over time, over the 12 weeks of the study. So controlling for any initial levels of mistreatment or counterproductive work behavior, how does it change over time? It allows us to infer causality in some sense, that mistreatment at time 1, if you're mistreated at work, you then commit more counterproductive work behavior at time 2. Okay, controlling, so mistreatment time 2, controlling for your mistreatment the previous week, predicting your counterproductive work behavior at time 3. So people who are mistreated then act out. This is in general with the whole sample. So, and this might be a situational influence in some sense. Counterproductive work behavior at time 1 predicts later mistreatment. So people who act unethically at work are then mistreated by their coworkers. And you see this strong relationship here that it's associated. And this is in general. So we see this reciprocal, this vicious cycle that people act unethically, then they're mistreated, and they're mistreated, so then they act unethically. What's interesting is how this changes according to moral character. For the high moral character group, this is the classification from the beginning, being mistreated at time 1 did not lead to counterproductive work behavior. Okay? If they acted unethically, they subsequently were mistreated by their colleagues, maybe they were punished by their colleagues, but this seems to stop this vicious cycle in some sense. So their boss was nasty to them, but they didn't go and respond by stealing things from work or behaving nasty back. So we see a much weaker relationship. This cross-lagged effect of mistreatment is non-significant. If you look at the low moral character class, you see quite a strong relationship. So counterproductive work behavior, or mistreatment, I'm sorry, they're treated poorly by others at work, and then they respond with counterproductive work behavior. So that reciprocal relationship that we see in general in the sample, particularly true of the low moral character group, not very true for the high moral character group. So we might think of this as moral character circumvents this cycle of mistreatment and counterproductive work behavior. Is that clear? Okay, good. So we do have evidence of a vicious cycle between counterproductive work behavior and mistreatment, but not for employees high in moral character. So if we think of how does moral character work, it could be in not, maybe it's through a self-control kind of mechanism that we talked about, not responding, in anger when someone treats you in anger, or something along these lines. Low moral character employees reciprocated mistreatment, high moral character employees do not. One thing that's interesting, if we think at overall levels of mistreatment, we still see the overall low moral character employees do commit more counterproductive work behaviors. They also are mistreated more often by others. So it does suggest that because the employees are acting badly at work, they then experience more conflict, more abusive supervision, and other things. So I think there's an interrelationship between how people act and how ethical they are, and then how they're treated by others. Okay, so I have many other results, but I think I'll stop here and give us plenty of time for question and answer. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I.
Any comments? We'll go Nancy first, so please put your hands up.
I was just really fascinated by this study. It's wonderful work, and I think it opens a new pathway to the heighten or bias discussion. I wonder, with your three constructs or factors, I don't know if I've got the term correct, that you had empathy and perspective taking, and then you had self-control and conscientiousness. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that you think desire for a moral identity is a different construct. And I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so I'm certainly not tied to this. This is not, an empirical analysis, but rather what I see as commonalities. It could be that people value having a moral identity because they have high concern for others, or because they have high self-control. But they could value a moral identity for other reasons. So this is, I want to be the kind of person who is fair, who is honest, who is friendly. So that's kind of what the construct is. It didn't cleanly seem to me to be consideration of others or self-control, and that's why I said, well, maybe it's something different. But I'm open to other thoughts if you have a connection you see with these other areas.
Well, I was just thinking that, this is a very, very broad philosophical brushstroke, so this is my disclaimer for philosophers in the room. The empathy perspective taking just strikes me as coming from John Stuart Mill, or something that's very attuned to that sort of tradition, and then self-control and conscientiousness you could sort of read as Kant. So, I'm thinking, thank you, sorry, I'm thinking that maybe number 1 and 2 just are different kinds of moral identity.
Oh, okay.
And the desire for a moral identity could undergird those. I sort of missed the first time through that number 3 is desire for a moral identity and not an actual moral identity.
Yeah, it's right. That it's the importance of moral identity is actually what the construct is called. And I certainly can, if we want to dive into the data, I have the correlations among all of these things. They are interrelated. So there is some relationship, some correlation. And it could be that some people care about having discipline and being conscientious. So that could be something that they desire. And others could care about being considerate and compassionate. So you could have a moral identity for either of these kinds of characteristics, I think.
John Doris.
Question. First, do you have any thoughts about the pattern of differences with self and peer reports in the first study?
Oh, it's interesting, and it verifies some other research. When you're doing bad behaviors at work, you don't want other people to see them, right? Stealing is generally private. And this is interesting because this is during a whole month, and this is only 1 week. So people are admitting to more bad behavior in 1 week than their coworkers are seeing in 1 month. But this is consistent with this idea that we're going to hide our more...
So just fewer observations.
Yeah, so, exactly, fewer. And, but what's interesting, what I like, is that we have the same pattern. So even the overall levels are different, and you get the opposite, right? For helping behaviors, because you want that to be public. So you want your bad behaviors to be private. You want your helpful behaviors to be public. But regardless of the overall differences, the models were strikingly similar in terms of what predicted things, what didn't. The only difference in terms of the demographic variables, age was related strongly, consistently to self-reported unethical work behaviors, but it wasn't related to the coworkers' observations. And I'm not sure if that's meaningful or not. It could be just not strong enough to see when you have less variance here, right? We're dealing with smaller variance. But other work with these measures suggests that self-reports are actually better than coworker reports because things are hidden. Again, these are anonymous research surveys. People are filling out over the internet. So it could be that if people would not admit so freely these sorts of behaviors if it was their boss asking them the question. So we're just, these researchers who send them a link, they don't seem to mind. And actually, one of the things that was surprising is that we did not pay people very much money to be part of this study, but what they really liked was being able to tell us about all the things they did, how they were treated, and they gave us so much positive feedback, like thank you for allowing me to tell you what a jerk my boss is, and yeah, I stole a lot from my work today. So I think people were honest in that sense.
And the other question is, do you have any information about drug and alcohol abuse? Probably a pretty robust predictor of late to work.
Yeah.
And it might be a confound with being low moral, who knows, separate vector. I was just curious. So here would be a striking result if low character was a better predictor than raging drunk
Right.
of late to work. So but it could be a confound.
Yes, it's interesting. We don't in this study. A requirement of being in the study was to be employed. So I'm not sure the late to work and raging drunk in the sample. All right. Other work does suggest that traits like, say, honesty, humility, which we found to be important, which does predict unethical work behaviors, also predict substance abuse. So in other work, the same traits that would predict these sorts of behaviors do predict substance abuse issues. Yeah, we can't address it with our data. This is a good point.
Okay, so I just have a question about the last point that you raised about low versus high moral character and then how people react to mistreatment at work.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can, I guess I'm wondering if that is stemming from, I guess I'm thinking that it could be the case, right, that there's some sort of threshold effect with mistreatment, right, for everyone. And if you don't get over that threshold, you're just not going to retaliate kind of thing.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm wondering if you looked at that or controlled for that, if it's just that the high moral character group aren't getting to that threshold. So it's not that it's a different mechanism or a different pathway, but just that they don't meet the bar for enough mistreatment to then retaliate.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think it's an interesting point. We haven't, these are somewhat new analyses, and we haven't been able to dig in fully. I'm not sure we actually could address that point, but I think the idea is if moral people really do turn the other cheek, or they do have better self-control, then maybe they just don't respond because they're, I don't know, this I guess because are they tempted to not respond, or are they just better at regulating that because they have a lower set point? We do know that the low moral character people are mistreated more, so maybe they respond more because they're mistreated more, and that's why it's interesting because there's this cycle, and it's hard to disentangle what causes what, but because clearly they both cause, the causal direction goes in both ways.
Maybe you could just select your, equate your sample sizes at time one, or not sample sizes, but equate them for level of mistreatment, and you'll end up with different sample sizes, but that might allow you to get at it a little more clearly.
Yeah, to look at, do they have a different threshold? So to the extent that they're treated equally, we equate mistreatment, do they just not respond, or is it that's just the low moral character people, because maybe they're behaving badly, are just faced with all this conflict? Their boss is just always yelling at them or something. Yeah, that's a great point. Look into it.
I very much enjoyed the talk, and I found it interesting and maybe a little disheartening that men seem to be so much more likely to be low moral characters. And this is a quick thing, but I just wanted to make sure I was reading that chart correctly.
So we classified the sample on the basis of their self-reports and the questionnaires, and then we just say, okay, if we look at this group, which is about 20% of the sample, or about 30%, how much of it is men, how much of it is women?
I guess the specific thing, if we just focus on the left, should the men add up to 100%?
No, here within low moral character it adds to 100%. Within average moral character it adds up to 100%, and within high. So say within each group, what is the composition? So overall, the sample contained half women and half men. But then if we chunk up the sample into these categories, within this category, what's the distribution of men and women? Within this other category, what's the distribution of men and women? So, all right, so let's see.
Thank you. Yeah, I was reading that wrong before.
Yeah, then we have.
Sorry, I was distracted. I was thinking about an old punk song by the Dead Milkmen called "Steal from Work."
Okay.
Performed by an all-male group, so it corroborates. I have a quick question about. Cognitive moral development.
Yeah.
Do you remember what slide?
Yeah, sure.
That's on when it was listed along with emotionality.
Oh, with emotionality?
Right.
Here? Or here?
Right. Yeah, you're right there. Okay. What?
Oh, the correlations with the work behaviors? Yeah.
Well, my question is, what do you mean by cognitive moral development? Because, or in what sort of way is it measured? Because as I understand, something like Kohlberg's theory, Kohlberg might have tested it through some self-reports, reasoning tests, and so forth. But what Kohlberg was explicit about it is that by moral development, he's talking about a sort of perspective. A social moral perspective. And it seems like that sort of thing could be captured if you go back to the you really don't want me to see that slide.
Oh, is this the one you wanted? I
Yes.
thought you wanted to know what moral development was.
It seems that perhaps some of those other factors could be included in a Kohlbergian sort of what he would call a cognitive moral development perspective. So what I'm asking is, is exactly what do you mean by that, and what differentiates that from some of the others?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, that more generally, just because we didn't find that these two aspects, two individual differences weren't relevant, doesn't mean that cognitive processes more generally aren't relevant. It doesn't mean that emotional processes more generally. So I'll come back to this in a moment. But cognitive moral development, what it is, it's actually something I was not particularly familiar with going into the study, but it's something that's widely studied. So we use this widely used measure called the defining issues test. And what it does is it presents people with a series of dilemmas, such as the hind stealing drugs for his dying wife. There's not a particular answer that they're looking for when they score it. And it's interesting that you can't score it yourself. You have to send it to the center. And they look at the complexity of a person's thoughts. So are you thinking about it in certain ways, how complex the thoughts are about it? So it's the complexity of a person's thoughts about difficult moral dilemmas is really what it is. I'm not sure Kohlberg would have predicted that it should be related to the kinds of behaviors we're studying, but certainly people use it within IO psychology, within other areas, to predict these sorts of behaviors that are not dilemmas per se. So it's I guess I'm going to say I'm not exactly sure what it is by how it's measured, but it is about how complex a person's thoughts, not about any particular choice they make. Now, different than some of the things we found important, like empathic concern, conscientiousness, these still might be relevant to moral development more generally, but these did a better job of predicting the work behaviors. Does that clarify?
So, thanks, this Adam. Anyone else? Please put your hands up.
My question is related to Charlie's, but I'm interested in the emotionality element. So if you can go to the slide.
Yeah.
So I see here that you've got fearfulness, anxiety, dependence, and sentimentality listed here. You're using the Hexagon 60 inventory.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about this measure. I mean, you said you might have thought that emotionality would predict positive work-related behaviors.
Or negative, yeah. So generally, there's been some prior work that suggests neuroticism, which is also a broad personality dimension that's related to this, predicts more negative work behaviors or less positive. You might think of emotionality or emotional stability and neuroticism. They're broad personality dimensions. If you classified all personality traits within only six things, one of those six things would be this, according to this framework. And so it taps into these facets of fearful, anxiety, dependent, sentimentality. There is some differences between emotionality as a construct and how it's been measured in prior work that might explain some of the differences. One key difference is with neuroticism or emotional stability, they tap into anger. People tend to get angrier more often or more quickly, whereas emotionality here and with this particular scale doesn't tap into anger, and maybe that's why there's no relationship, and maybe we shouldn't have expected one. But certainly some might say that the more neurotic a person is or the more emotional that they might respond poorly or badly. But
so I'm worried about this. Maybe I'm just worried about the measure here because you've got guilt proneness and empathic concern in the measures that predicted, right?
Yeah, so emotions matter, right?
Right, and so and these are emotion dispositions, right? I mean, so depending on how the questions are asked about, how emotional is this person, right? It seems to me that there's certain emotions that seem to be being picked out as being really important for measuring. Or for predicting positive behaviors, negative.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I think certain emotions are. Certainly empathy is an emotional process, having feelings of concern for others. But feelings of concern for others is not necessarily anxiety. And I think this is more about yourself. You're anxious about your behavior. So if you think of this as being an anxious person, being a fearful person, that's what's saying unrelated. Guilt prone certainly has emotional elephants. I anticipate that I would feel guilty, which is different than I feel guilty all the time. So someone who says I feel guilty all the time, regardless of what I do, they'd probably score high on emotionality. But guilt proneness is, if you were in this situation, if you received too much change in the store, would you feel bad about it, right? So it's not actually your level of daily emotions.
So did you use that inventory for the self-report and the
coworker report?
And the coworker report?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you used the same inventory.
Yeah, if you're, let's see. I do have the relationships between self-reports and coworker reports if you're interested. So this is people rating themselves and their coworkers rating them, and we see strong correspondence. These are people who knew themselves quite well, and even controlling for how much they might project onto their person, how similar they are. If you control for my rating of myself with my rating of you, you still get a high genuine consensus. So people can see how anxious, fearful another person is. They can also see how conscientious they are. They can also see how guilt-prone they are, which was interesting to us because we think of these things as kind of private. So that's a third paper we're working on with the data that I'm happy to talk about more. But basically the idea that moral character traits, we do see correspondence between the self-reports and the coworker reports, and we see the same pattern of relationships with the work behaviors more generally. So that is reassuring that it's not just something about how I think of my own personality.
Eric.
Can you go back to the favorite slide with the
Speak up.
Yeah, sorry.
This
So
let's see, the correlations?
Yeah. The
Okay, I have a full chart with all the traits if you want to see those
That's
as well.
okay. I just have like one. So first of all, I loved your talk, and I feel like now I know how to build a moral person. Those three things. So simple clarifying question, and then a conceptual question on top of that. Are these relationships like extroversion and agreeableness controlling for all the
No, this is here is just the bivariate relationships. Yeah, so that's
So then here's my question, because you get these
if you
correlations.
put them all in, what happens? Is that where you're going? Or no?
Well, sort of, but
Okay.
hold on. So I'm really curious about kind of the off diagonals, right? Who are the people who, because surely there's a lot of variance to be explained, who are the people who, despite that they aren't empathic and these sorts of things, still nonetheless do good things? You know, how can you get people to do good things even if they don't have these sorts of things? And so that's why I was asking if they're controlling, because I was wondering if things like, well, maybe just being extroverted, even if you don't have the ability to be empathic and these sorts of things, might get you to look pretty moral in the workplace. So do you have any ideas about sort of failing these really wonderful character traits? Were there other things in your data suggesting that even if you don't have those, you could still...
Yeah. Well, extroversion matters a lot for helping behaviors, not as much for the harmful behaviors, which is interesting and consistent. So for organizational citizenship, extroversion seems to be a big predictor. It's actually one of the strongest predictors we have when we look at all of the hexaco, all the big personality dimensions. Things you can do, it's not moral character. Well, certainly don't mistreat your employees, I think is a big one, because people who are mistreated, maybe they don't respond or maybe they don't meet the threshold, but they do often retaliate. So creating a better work environment, there are people that may be high or low in character that don't do the behaviors if they don't have the opportunities at work. So, but things like an ethics code that's pretty abstract, to have an ethics code that's not enforced is the worst. So actually having no ethics code is okay as long as it's enforced. We didn't find it to be a big effect, but maybe we're measuring it with one item as opposed to all of these different scales. Other things, I'm calling them traits, which maybe isn't the right word because they do change over time. And I think they can change across situations. So it's something like empathy. People have general levels or something, consideration of future consequences, but in any particular situation you can say, consider another person's feelings, or when you're making this decision about how to file your expense report, think about the company and think about our limited resources. Or so just because someone has a set point doesn't mean there's not a lot of variability around it. But the point I wanted to make is that these set points, people's relatively stable levels are important, but that's not to say that they can't. A bad person can't do good and a good person can't do bad, based, I think, on the reasoning you give, that there are things we can do in an office place or any environment.
So, two more quick questions.
I think you can use the word trait that way. Anyway, but that's not what I was gonna. So when you look at the vicious cycle and you saw that the vicious cycle held for the low character people, I wonder whether you would get the same pattern if you looked at high and low self-control. Like, is that
Separately?
Versus high and low empathy versus high and low identity.
That's great, I think that's a great way to look at it. We haven't, it's, so one of the complications here is there's all kinds of modeling issues that we've dealt with and missing data. So even though I present this because I think the pattern makes sense, we're still really having trouble understanding because our model fit in other things. And so I think it's probably a more complicated story than we're seeing. And you're probably right that it might not be the same thing with empathy versus self-control. And maybe there's a way at getting at that. One of the nice things that the classification gave us is we take these broad cuts classifications. Do we see differences? If we have a whole measure of self-control, I'm not sure what the right groups are. But we could say like on people that are really high and really low and look at it. So, what are your thoughts on how would it be self-control?
Right, but I would think like HLM and then self-control is a level 2 covariate because it's.
Oh, I was thinking more theoretically. What are you about? Would it self-control would be the mechanism?
Part would be that I would think that self-control might be more what's driving the sort of, versus empathy, but just thinking that people regulate themselves no matter what, and I can't make up a story like that for empathy.
Well, I think empathy would be more sympathetic. So it's like, yeah, my boss yelled at me, but he's having a really tough time right now. So I could make a story either way. Self-control certainly seems a plausible mechanism. I'm not ready to rule out other kinds of things. Like guilt proneness. If I were to do that, I would feel bad, so I'm not going to do that. So it could be multiply determined.
Yeah. Let's go with the last question.
Okay. So I was wondering whether you have looked at people's behavior. I was wondering whether you have looked at people's behavior in other contexts. That are not work, because it seems to me at work there's so many norms that we feel pressure to follow, and I wouldn't necessarily make conclusions about people's moral character, from the fact that they're helpful at work, because there's a lot of pressure to be helpful of other kinds, not specifically moral pressure.
Yeah.
And I would also say there's a kind of this feeds into the difference between men and women on moral character. There's a lot of social pressure that women, show empathic concern. Women are always expected to be very good. A man doesn't have to somehow be. It's just as a social thing. If a woman shows the character traits normally that a man would show, she's gonna be the B word. A man shows that. So I was wondering if we.
Yeah, so I think it's a great point. So in this particular study, we wanted to focus on the workplace because it gives us some set of behaviors that we could focus on. But what I want to highlight is that the personality measures from the initial battery were not in a work context. They were in general, to what extent do you consider other people's feelings? So our classification of moral character was not based on their work experiences, but rather on their personality, their self-reports, or also their coworker reports. That said, are the effects of moral character on unethical or ethical work behaviors limited to work contexts? And that, I would say, there might be variability across situations, but I don't think they're limited to just behaviors at work. There are definitely some constraints on people's work behaviors, but even in light of those constraints, we still see variability in the behavior. And other research, some of my own, some of other people's, have looked at non-work contexts, like substance abuse that was talked about earlier. And the same traits that we find important here to predict work behaviors are also found in other contexts. So it could be lying among undergraduates in an experimental study that has nothing to do with work, but it's the same. Self-control, might predict work behaviors. It might also predict behaviors in school or some other context. So that's not to say there aren't pressures that will influence, which I certainly think there are. And there was, I think, a second point that was the second part of your question. What was the second part of your question?
Oh, it was about pressure on men to show.
Pressure on women, and then
versus women.
Yeah, I think it can. So it's interesting. But certainly there could be reporting issues. And one thing with empathy, for example, is you do see on self-reports we get stronger differences, and then in reports from others and other things. But there still tends to be stronger correspondence. It could be the case that the behaviors are different for men and women. So we looked at an aggregated set of unethical and ethical work behaviors, so 30 different kinds of behaviors. Some are more directed towards the organization. Some are such as helping clean up the office or stealing from the organization. Some are more interpersonal, like being nasty or rude to others. And we don't see strong differences between the different kinds of work behaviors. We thought we might. We thought, for example, mistreatment would really predict whether you're nasty to your colleagues, that sort of category, but not necessarily stealing or other things. So we didn't see much difference. But given the work we heard earlier, there certainly could be different ways that moral character is expressed by men or women. And it might be they have different levels of certain traits. So it could be differences within the battery of moral character traits that we looked at.
Can I just say one more thing?
Sorry.
I'm happy to continue afterwards.
We got a big break now. So
Okay, so let's get drinks. So it'll be better conversation. Yeah.